The tension in the family rose like a silent tide, and by the time she realized it, it had already flooded the threshold, and Samantha became the epicenter of it all. Since childhood, she had been outspoken, fiery, and always rushing straight for what she believed was right. That straightforwardness had once been considered the brilliance of a child growing up between two opposing personalities. Martin with his discipline and toughness of a seasoned patient, Smitty with his calm and quiet protectiveness. But by the time she turned 16, the lines were blurred. A stubborn spark that no one could stop turned into a smoldering storm, a storm that found a favorable wind in Nathan and spiraled into a whirlwind that defied reason. What had been a fragile first love became a full-blown rebellion against the men Samantha both loved and feared losing. They looked at Nathan with suspicion, calling him a troublemaker with a charming facade and a mysterious shadow running behind him. They spoke of empty turns, sweet promises never delivered, and obscure bonds that were hard to name. To Samantha, all the warnings sounded like the click of a lock on her life. She felt boxed in by a definition hastily assigned by adults. Was this just a reflex against control, or a blind passion that grew from prohibition? The more forbidden it became, the more it wanted to break free. And amid all the noisy debate, did anyone really hear the loneliness that was beating so softly inside? The rhythm of life at Fairmont Crest seemed to flow smoothly, on the shiny surface of the tree-lined walkways and the angular windows, but inside, the hearts that shared the same roof were startled by every crack. Martin saw the signs of displeasure. His daughter's defensive gaze, the nights when her room light was left on late into the early morning. The family's neat schedule seemed to be shifted by an invisible hand, leaving subtle gaps that only a father who had lived with anxiety for a long time could feel. Smitty also realized, by being quieter than usual and more composed than before, that they had reached a turning point that was no longer simply a father-daughter argument. But no matter how much they tried to explain, the gap widened. Samantha was at an age where the longer the explanation, the louder the noise, and the more firm the prohibition, the more impulsive it became. Was first love a self-suggestion drug that turned every warning into motivation to prove one's choice right? For Nathan, that figure came to Samantha with the exact keywords that 16-year-olds crave: understanding, special, and being seen for who they are. The green light messages that appeared every night after curfew became a linguistic buoy to help her drift away from the shore of discipline. The long conversations about a journey away from Fairmont Crest and a new life without judgment, without rules, without harsh, prying eyes, sounded like a secret map to a free paradise she had drawn in her mind while locked behind closed doors. Nathan never gave details, but always, at the right moment, evoked the feeling of being chosen, of being complicit, in a private story that no one else could touch. That was how a promise unlocked Samantha's fantasy, turning the boundaries of reality into clouds and the shields of reason into fragile threads that could be easily broken. When Martin discovered his daughter sneaking around with her phone clutched tightly in her hand, everything fell apart like a door being suddenly torn open by a gust of wind. It was no longer a daily dispute about time or homework, but a clash between two frames of reference. On one side was the rough experience of an adult who believed she was saving her child from falling. On the other, the child's chest heaving, searching for a way to prove itself. The words rubbed salt into the pride of both sides, and a moment of angry sliding down the steps sealed the precipice. Samantha turned away, carrying her bag and the imposing coolness of someone who had become an adult in an instant. The house suddenly felt terrifyingly large. Martin stood frozen, Smitty placing a hand on his shoulder as if to ground him in reality. But reality was the closed door and the icy silence. Had the father just made an irreparable mistake, setting the ultimate boundary that is always the most dangerous in any struggle with adolescence? In Nathan's apartment, everything had been arranged to soothe the excitement of someone who had just crossed a border. The air smelled of victory, of freedom that came with defying the rules, and Samantha soaked in the feeling as if she were breathing her own air for the first time. Nathan opened his arms, smiled that easy smile that people used to associate with safety, and let the promises that placed heavy stones in her trust make her feel more anchored. But the longer she stayed, the more each hidden signal became exposed like a scratch that was hard to erase. Nathan's phone vibrated constantly with notifications he never answered in front of her. Questions about work, friends, money were avoided with smooth changes of subject that made the listener both vaguely suspicious and feel like she was the one being overly suspicious. Night. The apartment was filled with whispered conversations from the next room, often with her name mentioned, swallowed by the darkness between the walls. In that moment, the feeling of being seen turned into the feeling of being watched, and the boundary between the two turned out to be just a step. Martin, meanwhile, sat for a long time over Samantha's undrunk coffee cup on the kitchen counter, as if time could be turned back by the small ritual of picking it up and replacing it. Guilt came in undercurrents, bringing with it memories of the countless times he'd chosen to be stern instead of gentle, to rule instead of explain, to command instead of listen. He wondered if there had been some turn in the past that might have led to a less harsh outcome than today. Would he have noticed it? Smitty stood by, not saying much, but her understanding silence was the loudest sound in a house that had suddenly become too quiet. They began to reconstruct Samantha's schedule, sifting through the smallest clues, the shipping receipts, the browser histories, the thin traces of a child trying to hide what adults disapproved of. The biggest, scariest question suddenly wasn't when she would get home, but whether she was truly safe and in control, or had she entered a story whose script she wasn't writing. Nathan's change in demeanor became harder and harder to justify. His late departures from the apartment, his signs of behavior that didn't match his normal rhythm, his discreet instructions that Samantha shouldn't contact anyone at home to avoid trouble. Samantha felt herself being pushed into the position of a supporting character in a life she thought she had chosen for herself. The kitchen, where she washed a single cup and arranged her items out of habit to reassure herself, suddenly became a cold stage. Why were all the doors closed? Why were the windows overlooking the hallway always dark? Why did the cardboard boxes in Nathan's storage room have their labels scratched off? These seemingly small questions were the thread that pulled the pin. And when the doubt was strong enough, her 16-year-old survival instinct, which her family had once dismissed as impulsive, turned into a thin, persistent flashlight. Samantha began observing with the disciplined rhythm she had once rejected in her own home. She counted Nathan's departures, cross-referenced the time with vague announcements. She memorized the rhythm of locking doors, sliding latches, and the blind spots of cameras along the apartment hallway. She noticed that the small room had no mirror, but a low shelf with a thin, magnetic canopy, as if someone didn't want dust but just a view. One night, when Nathan was gone longer than usual, she tried sliding the canopy, slipping her hand into the darkness behind the panel. Her fingers touched cold, angular surfaces, then found a hard plastic bag. Inside was nothing but inactivated SIM cards, a spare phone without a SIM, a few photocopies of mismatched documents, and a list coded with initials. In that moment, her mind worked faster than her fear. The pieces came together in a way that sent chills down her spine. If the promise of escape was just a layer of paint on another plan, one that used a girl at her most vulnerable age as a link through checkpoints, where did she fit into that blueprint? Martin and Smitty simultaneously launched a silent search. They didn't raise the alarm loudly, knowing that defensive reflexes would push her further away. They searched through the footage from the roadside camera near the Fairmont Crest Gate, found a dark baseball cap, tracked a license plate with one letter obscured by a silver sticker, ran a back and forth on the junk mail list that had been on and off around the neighborhood for 3 nights in a row. The seemingly disjointed bits of information began to blur together, a picture not clear enough to be conclusive but thick enough to make one's stomach twist. They asked the question a father should never want to ask. Is this a romantic teenage escape, or a gateway straight into a vicious cycle of illicit profiteering that preys on the uninitiated? If it's the latter, is time on their side? In the apartment, Samantha placed the spare phone on the table, inhaling deeply to keep her hands from shaking as she scrolled through the snapshots. She didn't dare send them anywhere, but knew that their existence was a lifeline in case things got out of hand. She rummaged through the drawer near the door and found a set of keys with a plastic card wrapped in old cloth, the back covered in clear tape. She didn't know if it was a basement card or a storage room door, but the feeling of an organized network made her heart pound with alertness. Were the whispers last night about her own upcoming trip? Was the suitcase in the closet, with its dark clothes and a loose coat that didn't belong to her, meant to obscure her identity when passing through some transit station? As her reasoning raced, panic threatened to break her will, but a tiny voice in her head told her that fear could save her if it was tied in the right place. Nathan returned late, feigning calm, and everything was covered in standard, unflattering conversation. Samantha kept her face flat, swallowing the questions to avoid stirring up alarms. In her head, she was replanning, no longer a romantic escape scenario but an escape route. She counted down the time until she could use the excuse of taking out the trash to get out into the hallway, measured the distance from the apartment door to the fire escape, estimated the time it would take to cut through a floor to avoid the cameras. Was the rashness she had been scolded for turning into a life-giving energy? Was a teenager considered fearless, able to run through invisible barriers faster than an adult who was too hesitant? The night was torn into fragile layers of hours. At home, Martin and Smitty had pieced together a hazy sequence, just enough to know where to go. Before dawn, they jotted down the initials from a sidewalk source on a piece of paper, checked them against the list in their hands, and were startled to see that the two lines matched in an unsettlingly perfect way. An old storage facility on the edge of town, where the license had expired but the lights were still on at irregular hours. They left the house like shadows, carrying not only fear but also the sliver of hope that the worst-case scenario was just the paranoia of prescient fathers. Nathan's apartment was quiet in the pre-dawn hours when every nerve system was exhausted. Samantha knew there was only one small window to a real escape. When Nathan fell into a fitful sleep after the furtive calls, when the hallway was at its most deserted, when the camera was turned away for a few seconds to cool off, she lifted the plastic card, slipped the spare phone into her pocket, touched the doorknob like a switch to turn on a second life. But at that moment, a very faint sound rang out from the storage closet, like the clanking of metal against metal. Who was waiting out there, or what was waiting in the basement? Why was it that every time they thought they had something, all the clues ran into a new maze? On the edge of the city, where rows of warehouses lined up like abandoned skeletons, Martin and Smitty stopped the car. They had no perfect plan, only the conviction that they had to go a few more steps. A cold wind blew past, leaving behind the smell of rust and damp paper. In the dim light, they saw the black marks of newly installed cheap cameras, the silent language of activities that did not want to be interrupted by strangers. Each step forward posed a question. Were they in the right place, or were they just chasing shadows? If they were in the right place, what was behind each of those rolling doors? And if they opened the wrong door, would they alert the invisible beings who would immediately cut off their path back to Samantha? The moment when all the plot lines converge is always the most fragile. Samantha holds her hand on the doorknob, calculating 3 breaths before turning it gently. Martin stands outside the warehouse, measuring the force of the tug to pull open the rotten wood paneling. Smitty glances at the row of doors with chalk marks on the bottom that only those who have been here a few times will know. Nathan shifts slightly, like a scent hound being jolted along the ground. At this point, it is no longer a matter of right or wrong, of impulse or control, of love or deception, but a test of intuition against structures that seem real. Which of the 3 is getting closer to the truth, and which is falling deeper into the nameless trap? As the door between worlds is about to open, the final question flares up like a spark in the night. Will Samantha find the hidden room, the box containing the list, or the secret phone enough to expose Nathan's true identity before it's too late? Or will all the evidence just be enough to light the fire that she's been placed as a link, and now the chain is stretched? And if that line is only decided by a few seconds of silence that are about to end, will those who love her with all their clumsiness, mistakes, but also their determination to never give up, have time to reach out and touch the edge where she stands?